We need to have respect for all of creation. The buffalo were almost wiped out, but they will be back, and they will be strong. Mark Thompson's quote, while displayed in the American Indian Museum in Washington, D.C., spans themes from the Holocaust Museum and the African American Museum just as potently. So what defines a genocide? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the formal definition of genocide is the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially those of a particular nation or ethnic group. While killings were more than common in the cases of the Native American and African American history, I noticed that the only museum to openly use the word genocide was the Holocaust Museum. What makes this genocide different from the others? I would argue that it all lies in perspective. We as Americans are able to acknowledge the Holocaust as a major genocidal event because we were not directly responsible for it. The blood is not directly on our hands. I emphasize directly because I believe the blood is just as much on our hands, a concept I'll explore a little bit later. This concept also made me think of Milgram's shock experiment. These strangers were willing to administer fatal shocks to the strangers on the other side of the wall, as long as an authority figure was telling them to do so and was taking the blame for their actions. Americans, in the case of the Native American and African American killings, were unwilling to own up to the negative consequences of their actions, whereas we are quick to condemn the actions of others, i.e., the Nazis. The United States did not even officially recognize the Trail of Tears until the creation of the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail in 1987. I found our reactions to the Holocaust incredibly interesting in regards to this. I did not realize that the Americans had all of the information about what was happening overseas as it was going on. Instead of intervening, we decided to take a stance of neutrality. We refused to take in as many refugees as we could after liberation. Boats departed from Europe, bringing Jewish refugees to the United States, where they were promptly refused docking and sent back despite our knowledge of what they were trying to escape. The perpetrators of these events count on the inaction of bystanders. Does this not put the blood of the Holocaust victims on the hands of Americans? This idea of Americans as bystanders is not new. The perpetrators of genocide are not always the largest portion of the population, as was explored in Ben Valentino's TED Talk, Understanding the Causes of Mass Violence. The SS and the Holocaust, the KKK and segregated America, these groups were far from being the majority in their respective countries, yet were able to accomplish their violent objectives without much opposition. Lynchings were able to happen due to the millions of passive Americans who refused to take a stance and to take action against the KKK. Bystanders are just as toxic to a society as those with the malicious intent. Americans historically will exploit other groups in order to get what they want at any given time. This was infuriating to me, especially in the Native American Museum, possibly because I identify so deeply with my Native American heritage. The treaties exhibit displayed a blatant theme of betrayal on the part of the settlers toward the Native Americans. The specific example that summed it all up was the exploitation of the tribe we now know as the Iroquois for more land. During the American Revolution, the Iroquois lost land to the budding United States. Years later, when the United States wanted to expand into modern-day Ohio, they needed the help of the Iroquois to stand against the tribes already residing there. To ensure that the Iroquois did not aid the enemy, the United States drew up a treaty in 1794. The United States never honored this treaty, while the Iroquois still honor it to this day. The Americans and the Englishmen who precede them also have a historic difficulty accepting cultures that vary from the cultures to which they are acclimated. While present in instances with other cultures, the example of forced assimilation of Native Americans perfectly illustrates the stripping of a culture to destroy a nation of people. Littered around the treaties exhibit were quotes such as Andrew Jackson's, posing the question, what good man would prefer a country covered with forest and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms? With this attitude still very much present, how can we not acknowledge the actions against the Native Americans as a genocide, and how can we not see what is happening at the border right now is going in the same direction? Walking through these 3 different exhibits of cultures and oppressive events, I noticed that the genocides of these groups were carried out very much the same and was, unfortunately, able to draw parallels to our current society. The Native Americans were lied to and then forced from their homelands, only to be confined to reservations. African Americans during the slave trade were forced from their homelands and sold into slavery, confining them to the will of their owners. The Holocaust victims were forced from their homelands and confined to ghettos and eventually death camps. In all three cases, children were taken from parents, possessions were stolen, and the minority group was painted to be inhuman in the eyes of the majority. Is this not what's happening in today's administration? Muslims, Hispanic groups, and other minorities are being painted by our current administration to be savages and uncivilized. They are restricted to cages at our border. We are putting them in camps. Children are being taken away from parents. I wonder how far this can go on without the United States becoming the perpetrator of the latest genocide. This trip was incredibly difficult for me. I found myself filled with an incredible amount of depressed rage that I couldn't seem to shake, even when I was removed from the exhibits. I found myself to be incredibly protective of the information that was being presented in all three locations, getting very angry with viewers who said disrespectful comments or simply breezed past difficult sections of history. While children the same age as the children who died in the death camps wrote heartfelt letters and drew pictures to Daniel in the Holocaust Museum, adults seemed to shield themselves from the reality of the information placed in front of them. Are we this inclined to turn a blind eye to that which makes us uncomfortable? Perhaps this is why genocide continues to occur. How will we ignore it when it's on our front steps?